actually, once you start noticing that all the statues really are men, and that the names of streets are often named after men and buildings are named after men, you start to really kind of go, hang on a minute, that was hundreds of years ago often. Why am I not being reflected? We're 51% of the population. Why have we not actually burnt everything down by this stage? Which is a question I keep asking myself just now.
Zoe Venditozzi is a novelist, a mother and a teacher. She is also one half of the hugely successful, internationally acclaimed Witches of Scotland podcast. Her debut novel, Anywhere is Better Than Here, won the Guardian Not the Booker Popular Prize in 2012. So I just want to welcome Zoe Venditozzi, writer and one half of the wonderful podcast Witches of Scotland, to Fire Station Creative. Zoe's going to tell us about her book, Anywhere's Better Than Here.
Sure.
And various other short stories that you're writing and just what you're doing in general with the podcast. So over to you, Zoe. Please tell us about what brought you here in the first place.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. This is really nice. I was just saying this is so much more professional than our setup with our podcasts, where it's literally the two of us just in two different rooms with our laptops open on Zoom. So it's quite nice to be in a professional setup here. I feel quite glamorous. It's good. But I'm here, I suppose, because Claire, my partner in crime for our campaign, so it's Claire Mitchell QC and I, are running a campaign to kind of rehabilitate the image of the people that were accused of being witches in Scotland several hundred years ago, where 4,000 or thereabouts people were accused of being witches and about 2,500 people were actually executed. So we're looking to have them pardoned by the state, and we're looking to ultimately have some sort of national state memorial to mark them so that people can know about them and that people are travelling to Scotland or who are from Scotland can learn about it. And also so that women particularly are represented a little bit more in the statuary in Scotland, because at the moment we're not.
That's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. But before we go there, and you've done something that many, many women do, you put it away from yourself first into a campaign, as opposed to talk about you, the writer.
Me, the writer, yeah. It's funny because I don't sort of feel so much like a writer these days because things are so much time's taken up with the campaign and so on. But I am a writer. You're quite right, Laura. I am. And I do look at everything sort of through the lens of being a writer. And part of what we do with the podcast is about storytelling. So it's definitely about that kind of leaning that I have towards trying to put a story on things and understand things in the way that I would through story.
Yeah, I do believe that narrative is the way that people really start to engage, which has been so important in the Witches of Scotland. Your first novel, though, you won the Not the Booker award.
Well, I won the popular vote on the Not the Booker. It was actually won by, her name's now gone out of my head, really great writer. She wrote Life After Life, Kate Atkinson. So she actually won it that year. And it was such a brilliant book that I wasn't in any way annoyed by it. But I did already feel the point of the Not the Booker is it's meant to be books that don't get the big kind of publicity. And Kate Atkinson, of course, is like a huge name. But I didn't mind that she won it. It was okay because I did like the book.
Well, I read your book and I really enjoyed it. I would actually recommend it to anybody who's looking for something that engages with Dundee, engages with Scotland, and engages with a certain age group, perhaps. Both you and I are similar ages. And it was at that time, maybe within the past 15, 20 years of growing up in a city in Scotland. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a wee bit about the background of Anywhere's Better Than Here?
So it's about a young woman called Laurie, who all you know about her really initially is that she has graduated with a degree, but the degree isn't really of any use to her finding a job. And she's doing a job that she doesn't like. She's living in a flat that she doesn't like with her boyfriend of several years that she also doesn't like. But she doesn't know what on earth she's doing with her life. And the book's kind of an homage to a book called The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood, which was one of like sort of the earliest feminist novels that came out since the early 60s. And that's about a girl called Marion who knows that what she has ahead of her is to get married, essentially. That's what life should be, in inverted commas. and she just can't deal with that. She can't deal with the choices that she's got. So Laurie is kind of like a reflection on that, but in a much more sort of near to our time setting. And she's somebody who is, as the book develops, struggling a bit with grief. She's somebody who just doesn't really know what her identity is or where she's going. And I thought it was quite interesting, the idea that even though women now have so much more in the way of choices than our mothers or our grandmothers, women often still make the same sort of poor choices that are based on romantic ideas maybe of what life should be rather than what life actually is. So it's about Laurie and about her kind of getting away from her boyfriend, and not that much happens in it, but she ends up on the run at one point, and it doesn't go in a romantically satisfying direction.
I was fascinated by the way that it was a very gentle uncovering of who she is through walking through Dundee and leaving at odd times of the night and leaving her job and moving into a new job. But, you know, you mentioned there the Margaret Atwood Association, and is it called the Bechdel Test? What's the test?
Oh, yeah, about whether there's women involved in films. Yeah.
And, you know, you speak there of somebody making these wrong choices, because so much of our lives are about who are we with? Mm-hmm. Are we going to get married? Even now, we're still moving into those domains. And I found that the first person voice of Laurie and her doubts and her worries and her concerns and how she fumbled and basically stumbled into these different relationships to be fascinating. And at the end of it, I also found that fascinating because it was a truism of the kind of lives that we lead. Mm-hmm. The romance isn't there.
No, I mean, they're not. I mean, lives aren't romantic, are they? They're not. They're a series of kind of logistical choices that you make often, and I think it's really interesting. So I've got teenage children, and my middle one's my daughter. She's about to turn 17, and in many ways she's fantastically sort of empowered and knows lots of things and is quite strong about lots of different things. But there are still ways in which girls are shaped, and the images that they're bombarded with, and the idea of what it is to be a girl and what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And I don't really see a huge improvement in the parity between the sexes, even, with her. I mean, she's as I said, she's nearly 17. I don't see it really being all that different to when I was 17, really. I think they've maybe got a better language for things, but I don't think things have really particularly changed.
No, I don't think they have. And you mentioned, so without spoiling anything, Laurie doesn't have the support that her erstwhile partner does.
Yes,
she ends up leaving. His mother's very central to it in a way, and she's pushing his agenda without really helping Laurie. It's always to help her son, to help Laurie. Yeah. And I sit there thinking about the misogyny of women without understanding that they're misogynistic. They don't necessarily like women. Yeah,
I find that such an interesting aspect of being human and of being a woman. I find that really fascinating, the way that women are really often very horrible to other women. And there's this kind of notion we've got about a sisterhood and about how women help other women. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got really great female friends, really, really good friends who are totally supportive and really, really great and like brilliant pals. But I think the way that our world is structured, certainly in the UK, I don't want to speak for all countries, we're emulating, I think, what the male structure is. So it's this idea that women, you kind of need to kind of have your elbows out and you want to climb up the ladder and you want to be the boss. And, it's a real kind of like 9-to-5 model for what it is to be women. And I just 100% cannot be bothered with that at all. I really can. And it's interesting. So my daughter said to me the other week, she was quite distressed at the time, and I had to kind of keep a straight face because I was just thinking, this is so ridiculous. She was saying to me, I just don't know why anybody does anything in life they don't want to do. I'm just not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing a job that I don't want to do. And I'm not going to do these courses at school that people want me to do just because they want me to do it. And I was thinking, on the one hand, absolutely, you do your thing. And then on the other hand, I was thinking, but you will end up having to do things you don't want to do because that is life, and that you do have to do things you don't want to do to earn money, to pay for your overpriced flat and so on. So I thought that was quite interesting, and that's not really moved on. But one thing that I've really noticed and have come to learn through the idea about the witch hunts is that it was often women that accused other women. It was women that absolutely bolstered that situation. You know, they could have probably said more quietly in a circuitous way to their husbands at home, do you think maybe we could just dial it down a wee bit with the accusations of women? And it's something that male historians that we've discussed this with on the podcast sometimes say to us, well, it's not really a gendered issue. It's not really a feminist issue. And the women weren't accused of being witches because they're women. But I just keep coming back to the fact that if that's not true, I mean, I know there's lots of complex reasons, but if that's not true, why are 85% of the accused women in Scotland? I mean, that's not chancy, that's deliberate.
Mm-hmm. I think also this issue of competition as opposed to cooperation is a big one, and the societies that we live in have traditionally, in a masculine context, been competitive environments. We are moving into an age now where cooperation is essential if we're all going to survive, and we have to wake up to that fact. And this point in time when you and Claire both looking back to the miscarriages of justice, that needs to be brought to the forefront of people's awareness so we can start to reflect not just on the behaviour then, but on our present day behaviour towards each other. I mean, I understand that during the campaign you've received quite unpleasant Twitter contact.
A few, less actually than I would have anticipated. And it is men generally that have got something negative to say. And it's men that hate the SNP that use it as a real angle. Because I intermittently Google and look on Twitter, do the search on Twitter to see what's being said about witches. And Nicola Sturgeon is always being called a witch. Hillary Clinton was always called a witch. You know, it seems to be a word that is used particularly for female politicians, but any woman that really kind of gets above her station, so to speak. And I think that the criticism we've had is stop going on about it, you know, get back on your broomstick sort of thing. Claire and I always have to make the point of, well, we're not witches. And that's the point we're making, is there weren't witches. They were just ordinary people. And, you know, I'd always bring it back to, aren't we lucky that we live in a democratic society where if there's something that you care about, you can mount a campaign, and there is a really good chance that you'll be heard if you can prove enough people are into it. So I always sort of say, you know, start your own campaign if you think ours is stupid, and let us know about it. And if we support it, we'll support you. They never come back with anything after that, though.
No, it's actually quite it's a sobering situation to realise that the terminology witch, because it was so harmful, so destructive, is still used in the present day to undermine and demolish someone. I mean, certainly with Nicola Sturgeon coming out on International Women's Day and saying that the Scottish Government will pardon, that took huge political courage. I mean, it's not just a personal thing for her. She's making a statement about Scotland, and she knew what she was going to get in response. I mean, thankfully they're well ordered and they know how to deal with it. But you know, for you and Claire, I mean, Claire's a QC and you're a writer. Claire, in her position as a QC, has taken on a lot of, I mean, it's a very courageous thing, again, to do that in a position of, in the law. And I like the way she's done it in terms of a miscarriage of justice. It's a very powerful way to approach it. How have you found the legal side of it? Have you been working with her on that, or do you leave it up to her?
No, I mean, Claire's dealt with the sort of the nuts and bolts of the legal side of it. I always joke with Claire that I'm just really a sort of frustrated criminal lawyer. So I think just being brought up in a diet of things like LA law when I was a kid. So I enjoy learning about it through Claire, what it is that she's doing. But I think that because there's this precedence that was set legally about pardoning people that were found guilty of the homosexual acts, there's already that structure that's in place. So Claire realised that early on that's partly why the campaign started, I think, because she knew that had happened and this really wouldn't be terribly different. So she's written whatever the words are that need to be written for it, but using that had happened before. So it's actually not a big or expensive process to have the pardon, because it's really just a yes or no question. When it goes to the consultation, do you yes or no, think that they should be pardoned? So there's no sort of extra elements that need to be debated or thought through or argued. So I think it's fairly straightforward, and that side of it is really interesting.
It's the hearts and minds of the society that you need to win. And as a writer, as you said earlier, you've got that ability to be creative and interpret things in a particular way. Now, since the podcast started, a number of people, writers, artists, academics that you've brought onto that podcast is really extraordinary. I'm really interested to hear how you've seen the proliferation of literary work since the podcast began. Have you just uncovered it, or do you think it's really grown out of it?
I think that the idea of witches in fiction is perennially fascinating to people. I think so. There's always been obviously a good body of people writing about witches and so on, but I think that you can see that it's a kind of a focus point now, that there's people that are working away, and obviously as a writer it tends to be quite an isolated, kind of a lonely thing, and you might not hear about somebody writing about something until it found publication. But we can see people that get in touch now on Twitter that are saying, well, I'm writing a book about witches from this area or from this time period or whatever, and they kind of brought together with that, and it's a useful research tool. But I know that when Heel and Harrow brought out their folk album this year, it's just a few months ago I suppose it must have been, we had them on right back at the beginning of their project, and they said that they had been partially inspired by the campaign because it had made them, think about what they could be doing. But I've no doubt that it must be a strong element to folk in Scotland, sort of like the idea of magical women and, the sort of spells and things like that. So I'm sure it's always been there. But I think now it's just maybe one of those things where because you're looking for it, you see it more. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, to a degree, I think that's possibly true, and certainly on Twitter, all I get is witch stuff now.
Oh, yeah.
It's driving
a bit
me
much,
mad at the moment. But your daughter earlier, we were speaking with your lovely daughter, and she mentioned, what's it called? I've forgotten. Arthur Miller's play.
Oh, The Crucible.
The
Crucible, yeah.
So that's seen as an allegory for communism.
Yeah.
Which is obviously why it's had its longevity, and it really has whet the appetite of people. We're in a particular time where people are cancelled very easily for any view that's stepping outside of agreed conversation. Where do you think the witches fit into that? Do you think
I think it's that really similar idea that was mentioned before, about the fact that you're in the right group, and if you're not in the right group, then they're going to tell you you're not in the right group. I think one thing that I'm quite nervous of now is that we seem to have lost, and I just hope it's temporary, the ability to really talk about things in a complex way. Humans are complex, you could hold one view that somebody else matches you on, and there might be something else that you hold that's absolutely abhorrent to them. And I think that we need to stop thinking in terms of that we all need to be matches, like absolute ideological matches. I think that we need to be, you mentioned before about cooperation. I think we need to be thinking more about actual conversation with people. We need a kind of a truth and reconciliation. As Claire's mentioned this before about some of the current concerns that are argued about, where both sides get together and have a sensible grown-up chat about it, and then try and work out a way of moving forward. Because as a teacher, I know through many bitter experiences, if two people are just going to keep arguing about something, it's never going to move on. You have to find a way to help them to resolve it in some way and restore things so that you can, peace can break out. So I would like to see more of that. I don't know how that's actually going to happen, though.
It's an interesting question. There is also this issue going back to the misogyny or the attacks on women and gender-based violence. So your podcast has got a human rights element that's starting to appear in it now, and looking at the issues around attacks on women in general. Mm-hmm. There is at the moment, and there has been for some time, present day witch burnings, witch executions, justification for certain behaviours in different parts of the world. And you've had a few people on dealing with these particularly disturbing experiences. Yeah. Can you tell me a wee bit about how that impacted your view of the witch podcast?
So there's a campaigner called Leo Igwe, Dr. Leo Igwe, who's a humanist who I think originally, we had him on the podcast and he told us that he originally was training to be a priest, but then lost his faith, and I don't know if he'd used that phrase, but he certainly decided that was not going to be the course for him anymore. And he ended up forming a group called Advocacy for Alleged Witches. And that's something that I think is across the continent of Africa. So I think that there's quite a lot of work in Nigeria and Malawi. There's other places too, but they're the two that I've read about most recently with his work. And what he's doing is he's trying to really kind of confront modern day superstitions that means that the vulnerable in society are often attacked by mobs. And if they're not merely, and I'm using that word very carefully there, merely ostracised from their community, they're often actually maimed or in fact killed. And some of the things that he's shared through his work with that is incredibly disturbing. So like there was a story recently about a woman who, an old lady who had been attacked by her grandson, and there was footage of it, so it definitely happened, where she was killed and then burned, where her body was burned. And I think it was because the grandson ended up wanting to get her land. So, but there's a very strong superstition tie with that, where certain communities do really believe in witches and do really believe that they're doing harm, and that there has to be ways to sort of fight the witches and fight the evil that's happening there. And there seems to be evidence that because of COVID, there's that idea of looking for a narrative to explain why people have become ill and why people have died. And that seems to make sense in the way that it did during the witch hunts here. People became ill. There didn't seem to be an explanation for it. Who can we blame? If we blame them and deal with them, then the evil will go away, and it seems to be following those sort of patterns.
Yes, certainly, as you say, Africa, India, Papua New Guinea, there are some very, very serious cases happening in all these areas. Just as you know, I did that piece for International Women's Day,
which is so striking. It's so provocative, and I mean that in a really positive way. I think anything that provokes conversation and understanding and learning about our history and thinking about who we are as people, and I think that did it, and it was just really shocking.
Well, thank you. But one of the things that shocked me about that was I spoke to some people that lived near me, and I explained to them that I wasn't available till after the date because I was doing this. And one of the people got incredibly upset to such a degree that I really was shocked. And his reason for saying what he said was, you don't know what you will start up in people with this kind of thing. And I explained that it wasn't a real person, that it was a figure being burned. Ultimately, it became apparent that he had experience as a police surgeon in Africa and had witnessed victims of these burnings and these tortures. That really shocked me because we believe that we're so far removed from it, but the truth is we aren't. And time collapses very fast, and atrocities can happen at any point.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is there any danger in your mind that the question of the witch pardoning could be bringing up things in certain people?
I don't think that. I don't think that the witch pardon would lead to people then, sort of emulating what had happened in those days. I think that we've got enough horror and violence towards women that's already occurring that's completely provable, and the statistics that go with that, the amount of women that are attacked and killed yearly in Britain is just horrifying. So I think there's already an issue with that. I don't think that anybody would look at what you had done and think, oh, I might go down that route and burn people. I don't think that would happen. I think anything that makes people think about it. And so sometimes when we get resistance from people that say to us, oh, what's the point of that? That's daft, whatever. When you actually start talking to them about the stories and the, the numbers that were involved and so on, and really thinking about, what happened, probably where you're from, if you're from Scotland, there will be cases near where your house is. I think then people start to make a connection, and they start to think of the people that were accused as being actual people, not just this kind of like lump of humanity hundreds of years ago. It's got nothing to do with me. When you start thinking of them as being real people, I think that can make a kind of a connection in your mind that's nothing but helpful, because then you start to think of people as being individuals rather than just 4,000 people, 2,500 people.
And you start your podcast by saying the names of the witches women that day that you want to remember. So you would go through each of them. Now, we're in Dunfermline at the moment, and there were certainly a large number of people burned here.
Yeah, Fife was really, really into it, actually. And it's interesting because I went to school in Fife and was never taught anything at all about the witch hunts. And now as a teacher, if I was teaching in Fife, I'd be thinking that's a really great teaching tool, because there's a lot you can do with it about, about people being ostracized, or about how communities work, or about how belief systems work. There's lots of different things. Doesn't just have to be the history. There's a lot of kind of current modern issues that we could talk about, but we were never taught anything about it at school. I knew literally nothing when I started the podcast.
Well, likewise, I grew up in Kirkcaldy and I never heard a thing. We always were taught the sort of anglicised version of Scottish history.
Yeah.
But that's an important question. So we have got a resonance that sits 300 years behind us, but is impacting us now and impacting people's responses to others and fear that builds up in a society. So this uncovering for Scotland, this uncovering for Fife particularly as we're sitting here, how do you feel that this could maybe, feed into our cultural growth?
I think it's quite interesting. We had somebody on the podcast quite a while ago who is a psychoanalyst, and she was talking about generational trauma. So my day job is I'm a teacher, I'm a high school teacher, and I work with young people with additional support needs. So we work with young people that have got a variety of different needs, but there's definitely a growing group of young people who've suffered from trauma, and you can see how that impacts on people's lives. Like from things like they don't access education the way that somebody that's not experienced trauma. You might have that, and then you have lower amounts of choices that are available to you because you haven't jumped through the hoops in the way that you're quote unquote meant to. And I think the idea of generational trauma is really interesting because this, to me, logically, we don't necessarily have the paperwork because it wasn't kept properly. So it's really hard actually to track if you're the descendant of somebody that was executed, because they generally didn't keep notes on those people. So there are good records from the point of view of the database of the witchcraft, which University of Edinburgh made, which is really useful, and we use that to get the names that we mention. But the evidence they have on there might just be as scant as a person's name and the date of the trial. There might not be more than that. And in fact, in some cases, Claire's found somewhere it just said sundry witches. There wasn't even names. So it could be really like virtually no information. But there's no doubt to me that if you came from a family where, say, your mum was executed for being a witch, that would have a huge impact on you. If you weren't yourself then directly also accused and taken down, with your mother, that people in the community or the village or whatever would look at you then as, well, there's no smoke without fire, so to speak. If the mother was a witch, then, well, the daughter's quite dodgy. And then I think that would have naturally had an impact. People probably wouldn't have been able to earn a living in the same way. And then you might have had to have moved and start again, which would be no mean feat in those days. And Scotland was already a pretty poor society. So I think there's lots of evidence that once you are experiencing poverty, it's very hard to get back out of it again. And then you think about sort of in Fife in particular, the poverty that was there. If you maybe lost your job with that, well, then how would you earn a living? And then, Fife has got an issue today with people being able to earn a living in different ways. And I don't think it's a huge leap to think that there has been a modern day knock-on generational sort of rolling down effect from the times of the witch trials.
I think that's absolutely true, and sobering thought. When I was preparing for the witch art project I did a sort of a ratio of 4,500 people then, or even 2,500 people then, who were burned or killed. With the population then, what would it represent nowadays? And it was between 25 and 30,000 people now would be killed for this.
That's huge.
That's absolutely catastrophic for society.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's not just the person, it's everybody feeding off from that family and the impact of that. However, you also had somebody else on your podcast who was talking about not everybody was the victim. Plenty of them were the prosecutors, the ones responsible. The guilt of that must go down inside families as well. Yeah,
so either the guilt or, and this is a much sort of darker reading of humans, this sort of the sense of shoring up your power. If you had the power to do that, and then the potential for that to go really, a horribly wrong, entrenched attitude of entitlement, I think that's quite possible as well. So I think there's nobody really that came out of it, a kind of a clear, morally pure winner in that situation. I think it was really damaging. And of course, Scotland has got a a terrible bloody past, as most countries obviously do. So I'm not saying that that's the only terrible thing that happened in Scotland's past. There were lots of things. But I think that anything that we can do that kind of shines a light on things like that and helps us to be better versions of ourselves has got to be helpful. I think of it in similar terms as to understanding Scotland's part, and it's the money that it made and the wealth that it engendered with the transatlantic slave trade. I think it's really, really important that we are very clear that Scotland's not just this chippy little nation that's been attacked by England over the centuries, but that has managed to invent loads of really cool things, and aren't we great, and look at our tartan. I think there's a lot more to Scotland than that. I think that Scotland was very involved in lots of terrible things and benefited from it, and maybe acted out because they didn't have power because of colonialisation, and then themselves then took it out on other people that had less power than them. I think we need to understand that, because it's a big part of humanity, and it's why we make really terrible choices sometimes.
Now, that's so interesting, because this is a question I wanted to ask you after reading your novel. What struck me was this idea of your description of walking along roads. Now, you lived in New Zealand for a time.
Yeah,
and
2
I lived
years.
in Australia for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So both of us have experienced that moment where you're on a road and nothing in your life gives you any information. There's no memory associated with it. It's a new experience. And one of my experiences was going along to an art exhibition about is an Indigenous artist who's created something to do with poppies. And it was an island off New South Wales where the Aboriginal population was massacred.
Right.
And it was just prior to the apology that came out from the Australian government about the Indigenous people. And that's exactly what you've just said was my perception, that the people that came over, that took over Australia, took over the Terra Nullius, were mostly Scots, people who had experienced terrible privation and pain and anguish. And they weren't about to halt their possibility of success by not attacking other people. So the pain that they had experienced, what is it they say? Abused people abuse.
I think that can be the case, and I think if you've been trampled on, I think it's a natural instinct, an understandable instinct that you might trample on others. That you just want safety. We talked earlier before we started recording about fight or flight responses. And I think that sometimes people will think, right, well, I've been treated badly, so I'm ready to fight to kind of scrabble a way out of this difficulty. So I don't think it's a big leap to think that it's easy to other people if you're coming from a bad place, and especially if the belief system at that time. So the belief system during the times of the witch hunts was that witches were real and that the devil was abroad, and that you had to conquer witches in order to stop the devil from taking over the good folk of society. I think the belief system partially when people moved to Australia, and I say moved, that sounds really kind of like people were like, we're just going to move to Australia, when they were sent across as convicts, for example, or when you had Scots that went across and worked as overseers in the plantations in the South of America. They were trying to make their lives better, and the idea that they had was that the Indigenous people or the people that had been brought into slavery weren't really people. The belief system then amongst many people was, these are not people that are on the same strata as us, therefore we can treat them poorly. I think that was the same sort of view during the witch hunts. These are not people like us. These aren't good and godly people. These are people that are working with the devil, and therefore they deserve what's coming to them. And this is how one must deal with somebody that's been taken over by the devil. It's the danger of belief systems like that if they're not questioned.
I remember hearing, I think it was Claire had said that what struck her as incredibly moving was some young woman, she was only very, very young, saying, can you be a witch and not know it? Mm-hmm. So it does sound a bit like the torture and the gaslighting and all these things made people put into people's minds that they were justifiably a witch.
Yeah.
I actually, even using the terminology witch upsets me. I try to avoid it.
Yeah.
But was there an age demographic more commonly associated with this? Was it younger or?
I think it was mostly older women, and older in those days probably wouldn't be what we'd think of as being older now, because life was so brutal and so short, I think, generally. But I think it tended to be older women because, you know, they'd been around for longer, you know, and had maybe displayed behaviours that people didn't want, you know, for longer. So I mean, we know that the myth that we have that those that were accused, the women that were accused, were standing up to patriarchy, and that they were, you know, red-headed, left-handed herbalists that delivered babies. We know that that's essentially a myth. There will, of course, have been women that were red-headed, left-handed, blah, blah, blah. But it wouldn't have been because of those things that they were accused of being a witch. And it wasn't, we have this idea, some people have this idea in the modern day that it was like beautiful women and they were too attractive, and that's where they were accused. The sad fact is that people were accused for all sorts of reasons. They were just ordinary people that were trying to go about their lives, and for one reason or another, they fell foul of the community in which they lived. You know, and it could be that they were argumentative, or they could be drunks, or they might have what we think of now as having a learning disability or a physical disability, or it could be that they were old, or it could be that they were sort of in with the wrong crowd, or it could be that they were beggars. So we've seen this quite a few times, that they might have gone round people's doors begging for some food or some money. And if they were turned away and then something happened to the household afterwards, like maybe a couple of days later, their cow stopped giving milk or something, they might look for a narrative to explain that happening and say, oh, it was because we sent away Jeannie Watson and we didn't give her anything to eat. And then lo and behold, the cow stopped, she's cursed us, she's a witch. And then the ball would start rolling with that. So people were accused for all sorts of reasons. But it wasn't usually, people have a notion as well that there were people that would identify themselves as being witches and that they were isolated in the communities. People didn't tend to think like that because they were almost all Christians, and they were very entrenched in the belief system. You know, everybody was quite performative about it. We mentioned earlier that people were fined for not attending church. You know, it was you were compelled to behave like everybody else. So these weren't times where there were necessarily women being individuals, you know, stirring a pot. You know, do you know what I mean? We have a modern notion because of film and TV that's given us those ideas.
Which is a dangerous idea and a dangerous position, because people thinking that what they've seen in horror films about witches is the reality of what was happening then, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
The woman that I focused on, Agnes Sampson, one of the things that they used against her was the prayer she said, which is very clearly a very Christian prayer and a very long one to heal people. But actually, I was thinking about the Scold's Bridal. You've probably seen it in the Museum of Scotland, which was a device used for both women accused of witchcraft and anybody accused of gossip.
Yeah.
I have never seen anything so horrific in my life.
It's horrifying. I mean, in Scotland, we supposedly weren't really into torture, but there were, I think probably there was maybe less torture in Scotland than there might have been in other ways to extract confessions. And Scotland seemed to rely quite heavily on the keeping people awake for long periods of time, which is recognised now obviously as a very effective form of torture. It is torture, but it's not the thumbscrews and the Scold's Bridal and so on. I think there are some people that are really interested in the methods of torture, you know, and I've read about people that have talked about how they've got collections of things that were used, which I just think is horrific and really distasteful. But I think that there probably wasn't as much of a need to torture people, because if you keep people awake, people will tell you anything, you know, I think beyond a certain point. And we know that it's viewed now as very poorly, that it's a really poor thing to do. But, you know, anybody that's ever had a baby knows if you've been kept awake for a few nights with a baby that you get very worn down very quickly, or if you've been unwell and it's kept you awake or whatever, that it doesn't take long before you lose your defences. So I sort of imagine the women that you mentioned there that said, you know, can you be a witch and not know it? I just wonder whether she'd been kept awake for long periods of time, or if she thought, I will just tell them anything so that they leave me alone. And I know myself that I'm not a witch, but maybe if I say to them, well, maybe I am and I don't realise I'm a witch, they'll stop this and they will let me sleep and I'll be allowed to go. But of course, once you confessed, you'd sealed your fate. That was it, really.
It's a really dark and shameful time of our history, and whether or not it was acceptable due to the religious convictions at the time and due to the criminal courts, it was done through the criminal courts.
Absolutely,
in Scotland,
yeah.
which is why it's so impressive to see both yourself and Claire doing this. So I do hope that it will start to make people think differently. Going on to your own work and your next stages for writing, I read a short story of yours which was really fascinating about a young girl and a psychiatrist, and I think it's an electric
literature, yeah. So I think it's called Electric Lit. So if you Google that, it should still be there online.
I would recommend reading it because, again, you capture certain things which are just so subtle and so beautifully phrased. Things to do with her focusing on the tile in the toilet so that she could deal with the psychiatrist who is just creepy and
really
very,
sort
very
of abusive sort of psychological relationships, really odd. But whether she's telling the truth or not, I don't know. I went on to write a book after Anywhere's Better Than Here, called Vitals, which I'm looking for a publisher for just now, and that's about a woman, two women who meet. One woman who's just had a baby and she's really lonely. She doesn't have any friends where they've moved to, and the other woman is a young woman, maybe sort of 17, who's a carer for a mother who refuses to leave the house and hasn't left the house since the daughter was born. And the younger woman thinks that she can foretell people's deaths. So when she meets you, she can see in her, if it's in her mind's eye, it's not really clear, but she can see the person's date of death, and she often has the method of death whispered into her ear at the same time. And you don't know in that book whether she really does see and hear those things, if she is actually, having this kind of psychic phenomenon and there is a thing that's happening, or if she's mentally ill and this is just something that she imagines. And I'm quite interested in that, about who's telling the truth and if they know if they're telling the truth. I suppose it goes back to that woman saying, can you be a witch and not know it? This idea about whether you really know what's actually happening in your mind or if you're deluding yourself in some way. I find that quite interesting.
Of course, in our world, in the sort of modern world, we've reached the point of understanding that we are not in linear time. Time actually expands around us. And that suggestion would sit with that, in the sense that we could actually read to the future, and we're not imagining it, it's actually there.
Yeah.
The idea of, I think you mentioned in the electric literature, she couldn't decide if I think it was tiny insects inside of him or him in tiny forms inside of himself.
Yeah.
The psychiatrist. And that fractal idea really is interesting. Like, is everything at a smaller level or a larger level, can it all be read? Is it already foretold?
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting just thinking about who we are, what our identity is, what we think of ourselves, what other people think of us, who's our real self, what are we showing the world and what's really in our minds. And I think as I get older, I'm 47 in July, and I've reached a stage now where I'm just kind of like, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to do what I want to do. I don't mean murder people or anything like that, but watch the space, only joking. I make jokes like that, and Claire always says to me, don't say that in front of me in case I have to represent you, but just joking. But I think that there comes a point where you have to say, I am much less interested in what society wants me to be like. I'm much more interested in doing what I feel like doing, and that might be that I feel like not going out. It might be, I don't mean like becoming a shut-in, but it might be that I don't want to socialise, or it might be that I want to socialise lots. Whatever it is, I just think it's interesting to sort of come to a point in life where you're much less focused on what people want of you and much more focused on what you want for yourself.
That description a wee bit earlier of this novel that you called Vitals, the idea of the carer and somebody who's locked in or shut in there through helping somebody else, is very much of the zeitgeist. I mean, we've had 2 years of this and things are not improving medically and support is not there. So, I mean, you're really catching something which is very much in people's minds.
Well, I should say that to publishers. That's good, Laura.
I believe that's true.
Because I wrote it before the pandemic, so I'm working on something else now. But I wrote that when I finished the first novel, and I haven't really progressed it because my kids are quite small. But it's finished, and I'm just looking for a publisher for it. I would like to get shot of it.
I'm really also interested in how visually powerful your pieces are, and that they are all set in Scotland, and I really think they could be screenplays.
Oh, I'd love that.
I mean, they've got such I mean, firstly, anywhere's better than here. What a statement for I see it as a statement for women. Maybe men feel similarly, that they also can be trapped. But it was just this, you make these choices and you end up in a situation and then like your life's going nowhere.
Yeah, yeah.
And that speaks to the human condition.
I think so, yeah, that you get trapped. You know, you start paying rent or you start paying a mortgage and you have to keep earning the same amount of money to keep that going. And, you know, now more than ever, we're being told constantly that we're trapped because money's such a massive issue. And, you know, there just feels like there's a lot less choices. And, you know, like, so my oldest child is at art school in Glasgow. So he's looking for a flat for second year. And I'm quite anxious about it because I keep hearing about how there's a real flat shortage in Glasgow, you know, and how much is that going to cost, and you know, that sort of thing. And you become very trapped with things like that instead of just doing, you know, having more freedom to do what it is that you want to do. So I think it is tricky, and I do think that for younger people now, maybe it's harder in some ways than it was when I was of that age.
I think what's interesting about this type of situation is we can either be controlled and constrained by these boxes that economy suggests we should be in, or else we look at it and we think, well, okay, can we free our minds? We can accept that, but can we free our minds? And two things. Your mention of the psychic element of this second novel is interesting because it's moving in that direction. And the other thing is, do you remember the Black Panthers? I don't remember the chap who was the writer who came from the Black Panther movement, but he was put in prison. And his greatest writing came out of that because he said they can control my body and keep me physically, but they can't control my mind.
That's really funny. We were talking about the Black Panthers in the drive down to Dunfermline today. We're talking about Tupac Shakur. And about his mum and also possibly his dad. One of his parents, at least anyway, was involved with the Black Panthers.
That's right, yeah.
I was telling the kids about how I'd watched something where Maya Angelou had told Tupac Shakur off for using the N-word, and she was kind of schooling him on the struggle of black people. I always found that really interesting.
I thought he was one of the most stunning people I've ever seen, and to die so young was
just crazy. Yeah, and so we ended up having that conversation about what would he be doing now.
But they have a lot, you know, that their experience is actually a universal experience. That's why it's so interesting, the Black Lives Matter dynamic, and all of these things are so interesting because they're targeted, but they're targeted by power mongers. As we at different points have been targeted by power mongers. It's not the same. I wouldn't suggest it is because of the circumstances. But I come from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, and we had a similar issue around, you know, people's political viewpoints and, you know, people being shot. And but it's this issue of, can we use, and is it a teaching thing, where we tell people or teach people how to think differently? Because you started by saying you're a teacher in schools and the schools are not succeeding and they're constraining kids in an industrialized dynamic.
Yeah, which I hate.
Yeah, can you see a way through your creativity and your writing?
I would like to say that I could see a way through it, but I think that we are so wedded to the idea of the way that school has to be, and you could see it during the lockdown. We had a real opportunity there to really rethink what education was going to be, and there was a lot of chat initially, the first sort of 6 or so months, I think, where people were saying, wow, we've got this amazing opportunity, we can really make education much broader. And then of course everybody went, oh, but hang on, we need childcare. So the schools need to be open and schools need to run the way that schools have always run. And actually, the kids have missed so much school now that could you run them for longer and have less holidays? And actually, that'd be more convenient for us working, so the children would be getting looked after. And, you know, and it's this real kind of capitalistic construct. It's really just about making money. And now we're at a stage where we're talking about making just enough money to survive for many people, and not even that for a lot of them. You know, and I just don't think we're ever going to move away from that anytime soon, which is really sad. So I just try and make school as pleasant as it can be with the young people that I work with. But I do find myself a lot saying to some of the kids that I work with, just play the game. Just give the teacher what the teacher wants, so that you don't rain down stress on yourself. Because I work with quite a lot and I have traditionally worked with young people that struggle maybe with behaviour in school. But really, what lesson is that giving kids? Really, it's just, you know, bow down to the master. So I really struggle with that, and I hated school myself, loathed it. I can't believe I became a teacher.
Likewise, I'm the same. I detested school.
Yeah. Really struggled with it. And I know why I became a teacher. It's because I wanted to be the kind of teacher that I needed when I was at school, which is, you know, like a friendly face. you know, that was there in a difficult day, in a difficult life, you know. And a lot of the young people I work with have got really difficult lives, you know, really hard, you know, like from real poverty or difficult backgrounds, or they've, you know, maybe because they've got something like dyslexia or something equivalent, that it's hard for them because they don't fit into the way that, you know, quote unquote, a normal school pupil would live. So I always push, you know, the creative arts are that's the most important thing. And I'm not an art teacher, I'm an English teacher by training, but I think that the world of stories is a big part of that, and expressing yourself and seeing yourself on the pages of stories or in films or whatever is really, really important, you know. And I think that's why representation is so important. I think that is a very similar part of the Witches campaign, is that women aren't represented in statuary. And I know that some people will initially hear that and think, well, really, what does it matter? Actually, once you start noticing that all the statues really are men, and that the names of streets are often named after men and buildings are named after men, you start to really kind of go, hang on a minute, you know, that was hundreds of years ago often. Why am I not being reflected? You know, we're 51% of the population. Why have we not actually burnt everything down by this stage? Which is a question I keep asking myself just now. Like, why are we not actually revolting in the streets about what's happening just now? What is stopping us? You know, why am I not doing it? Because I feel so strongly, and I don't know what the answer is. And I think that's why school probably won't change too much in the short term, because you're kind of paralyzed, because you do want to keep a roof over your head. So you've got to keep playing the game, which is a trap.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt about it that at times of the worst economic constraints and politically dangerous times, they push creativity and philosophy out of schools and out of universities.
Yeah.
And we don't, apparently, our society doesn't want thinkers, but that's exactly what we need.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you know, have rightly said, it's through literature, it's through art, it's through these different awarenesses that change comes. But I mean, it's been fantastic speaking to you today, Zoe. We've covered so much ground there.
It's lovely to chat. Yeah.
I'd love to see your new book, Vitals, on the shelves. And
yeah, me too.
Any future work that you do. I would really recommend that anybody who can read your novel, because it did bring something into my heart that I'd forgotten about. I'd really forgotten about growing up in Scotland, and I really enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, thanks very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And to Fire Station Creative, which has been
lovely
a great venue.
Yeah.